May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. So we have earthquakes and famines and plagues. Oh my. And you add to this we hear about the destruction of the temple. We hear about persecution for doing what's right. We hear about false messiahs. This is quite a gospel that we have today. And you know how Jesus will kind of like wear different hats. Like sometimes he's the teacher, the rabbi. Some days he's the healer. Today he's kind of wearing that scary prophet hat. And it kind of sounds like he's predicting the end of the world. He's very much predicting the end of the temple, that fall, where he says, not one stone will be left upon another. But for the author of this gospel, of Luke's gospel, by the time he wrote this, these things had already happened. The temple had already fallen. And these wars, the earthquakes, the famines, they were just kind of happening all around. This was kind of like, it was the early Christian reality. And most scholars think that this gospel, the Gospel of Luke, is written around the year 85 AD, kind of give or take a little. And so if we remember our history, by that time, 15 years earlier, in the year 70 AD, there was a Jewish uprising. And so this uprising happens, and Rome comes in, and they put down this rebellion, and they burned Jerusalem, and they tore down the temple. This is like one of the most incredible buildings the world has ever known. It was said that Jerusalem and the temple burned so hot that the rocks in the temple were exploding. People were inside. This was horrific. So my point is, these events that are described in our gospel today, they did indeed happen. And these false prophets that Jesus is talking about, there's like a list of at least a dozen other people in the first century claiming to be the Messiah, right? Earthquakes, famines, those are talked about in the book of Acts, which is like the sequel to Luke's gospel, so those were happening. Wars, destruction, religious persecution. This was the norm for early Christians. This was kind of like just the turbulent air that they breathed. And so what this means, I think, is that our religion, Christianity, was born in a world of chaos and unrest and uncertainty, anxious times, right? Sound familiar, right? So here's the thing. Christianity was born into a world of chaos and confusion, and it was born for a world of chaos and confusion. It was born into a world of violence and injustice, and Christianity was born for a world of injustice and violence. And Jesus says that it is through enduring that we will gain our soul. And so this word soul here, the word we hear today is from the Greek word suke. And we hear a variation of the Greek in our modern word psyche. So like kind of the root word of psychology. Sometimes Greek lexicons will translate suke as breath or life force. And so what Jesus is saying today is that we gain our life force by how we act in the face of hardship and tragedy and the trials. Jesus is telling his disciples, in the face of all that is going on around you, do not be led astray. Stay the course. The gospel today kind of begins with his disciples kind of gawking at the beauty and the size of this magnificent building, the temple. And he says, don't be led astray. Buildings fall. Save your all for the things that endure. And then Jesus says, when you read the headlines, and when you hear the talk around the office and how that's of war and famine and division and nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom is what it says, or as we say today, political party against political party. When you hear the talk of division, don't be led astray. Stay the course. Where there are false prophets and false messiahs and leaders speaking untruth, don't be led astray. Don't follow them. Keep following the way of truth and love and justice and all the things that Christ stands for. Enduring will bring you life. And I think Christians need to hear this as much today as they did in the first century. War and famine and earthquakes and plagues and false prophets, we've still got them. We've got all that and more. And it goes kind of without saying that there's no shortage of things to make us anxious or angry or afraid. There's no shortage of problems in this world that we must endure. The end time is always happening somewhere in the world. And you can kind of tune into that on your handheld device 24/7. But by endurance, we will gain our soul. And endurance here, as Jesus is using it, it doesn't mean that we put our heads down, kind of take it on the chin, bury our heads in the sand, ignore it. It doesn't mean that we suffer it gladly. I think what Jesus means here by endurance is that we persevere. And we kind of do that St. Francis thing. And so where there's hatred in this world, we persevere and we sow love. Where there's darkness, we persevere with light. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope, sadness, joy, we persevere. Jesus is calling his followers, us, to keep going. And as Paul writes to the Hebrews, let us run the race with endurance, the race that is set before us. So I'll close with a true story. When Martin Luther King Jr. was 26 years old, think about that, he found himself as the leader of the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama. And so for his work in this movement, he was threatened by the KKK, and he was harassed by the local police. He was driving 5 miles over the speed limit. And for that, he was arrested, and he was thrown in jail for the first time in his life. And after he got out, this is the night after he got out, his kids are in bed, his wife is asleep, and the phone rings. He picks it up, and the man on the other end says, if you're not out of town in 3 days, we're going to blow up your house, and we're going to blow your brains out. And so, like you or I, King was afraid for himself, for his wife, for his little girl. And so, with shaking hands, he hangs up the phone, and he pours himself a cup of coffee, and he sits down at the kitchen table, and he later said, I sat at that table thinking about that little girl and thinking about the fact that she could be taken away from me at any minute. And I started thinking about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife who was asleep over there. And I got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. I was weak. And I discovered then, he writes, I discovered then that religion had become real to me. And that I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee, and I will never forget it. I said, Lord, I am down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I am weak right now. I am faltering. I am losing my courage. And King said, it seemed to me at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And I will be with you. Endure. Stand up. Persevere. In our gospel today, Jesus said, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons. And you will be brought before kings and governors. But Jesus says, I will be with you. And I will give you words and wisdom that your opponents cannot withstand. And not one hair of your head will perish. So 3 days after that phone call, when King was told to be gone or else, someone did put a bomb on his porch. And it went off, and it blew off his porch. But nobody got hurt. And Dr. King wrote, my experience at that table a few nights before had given me the strength to face it. This is the endurance that Christ is talking about. It's the strength to face it. Whatever it is for you. That endurance he talks about is standing up for what's right, for what is love, in the face of whatever evil or ill this world or this life will throw at us. By our endurance, we will gain our souls.